Yeah. And I mean, I would argue that you should, right? If you're in that situation where you're expecting that I could be hired into a GM role or head coach role in the next year or two or three even, you should be doing a ton of preparation in the offseason. Like, to me, it's like if you have studied for the test, like the test shouldn't be hard.
Right.
So, like, and I'll give you an example because I come from originally a legal background. The bar is like a 3-day intense test, and you do like a month and a half prep class after 3 years of law school. And it's like by the time you get to the test, like, you should just nail that thing. Like, you shouldn't still be thinking about it the day before the test. Like, you should just get a good night's sleep and show up. Like,
Yeah, it only took me one time, so
there you go.
So as promised, this is the one person at the top of my list to tackle all these coaching interview processes, questions. Like, I am in the dark. I have no idea. I'm just a downstairs guy. I want to know how people upstairs live in an NFL building. And so I'm having on Hannah Gordon, and I'm so excited to welcome Hannah to the show. Hannah, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Chris. How are you?
I'm doing great. We got a mutual friend in James Hall. Obviously, I told people about your history with the Raiders, and I know we probably know a lot of the same people from there, but the Niners as well. And then the work to me that's so interesting that you're doing now is some of your consulting stuff with guys who are trying to get head coaching gigs. And I think that's just the NFL schedule is so perfectly laid out all year when it comes to stories. You know, we get these playoff games right into the hiring cycle and the whole thing, but my first question to you would be, is this process laid out from a chronological standpoint and a timing standpoint as close to perfect as it could be with guys interviewing in the playoffs? Could it be better?
Yes, it could be better. No, it's definitely not perfect. I think, and you've mentioned this before, and I don't think enough people probably talk about it. The process for hiring people who are going to run a multi-billion-dollar business is unlike every other multi-billion-dollar business in the world. In any Fortune 500 company, there would be a months-long search. You would, talk to a lot of different people. You would take them through potentially 4, 5, 6 rounds of interviews. They would interview with a whole lot of different people. And this is such a compacted schedule. And then the other thing that's wild is that the next layer of interviews and hires happen in a matter of days, sometimes weeks. Whereas if you are an executive taking over a multi-billion-dollar company somewhere else, it's probably going to take you 12 months to turn over a staff, right? And bring in the right next layer of people. So is it perfect? No, definitely not. And it's even harder, I would argue, for people who are hired as general managers, because if you're hired as a head coach, you are coming in after that team season that's hiring you, at least.
Right.
But you're 3/4 the way through your cycle if you're a GM.
Right.
Like, you're about to hit free agency in the draft,
Right.
and somebody else has been doing the work for that for the last 3/4 of the year.
Do you find that there is a solution, or do you feel like if you slide one thing here, you're gonna mess this phase up, or that sort of thing? Like, is there a tweak that they could possibly? Is there a tweak they've ever talked about making? Because I think coming from the player standpoint, it's more just pointing out the hypocrisy of coaches being able to do this. And I understand, like, there's no other time to do it. Like, there are rules and regulations that I'm learning about every day when it comes to the scheduling of these things and the prep time that they can have, but still juxtaposed to players not being able to say boo until the season's end, and start their journeys into free agency. Like, it is a totally different deal. Is there a distraction element, and can they improve upon that?
Yeah, so I think the distraction element, to me, and obviously I didn't play the game, right? So I don't have your perspective as a player, the potential frustration that your coach is interviewing elsewhere. What I would say is, from the flip side of the people doing hiring, if I'm hiring you to really be responsible for the product of my multi-billion-dollar business, I'm going to pay you millions of dollars a year to do it, I expect that you know how to manage multiple projects at once, right?
Right.
I expect that you are a high level, thinking executive with great time management skills who can prepare for the most important game of your life and take a job interview that in theory you've been preparing for years, right? But really both of those tasks, a lot of people would say like, I've been preparing for this my whole life. So you should be able to handle it.
Do you find that any coaches that you've dealt with have had trepidation when it comes to multitasking and need a little bit of encouragement when it comes to like, hey, I've got to be able to get you to prep for this a little bit. We know we've been doing it all year. I know you got a big championship Sunday coming up, but these interviews are important to your future. Have you found that coaches have had trouble wrapping their head around that at times?
I mean, again, I don't think so, but you had a great segment you didn't really fully do, which was whose ego is bigger than whose, right?
I can't wait to do that segment.
Yeah, you've got to do it for one thing. But like only type A personalities go into this line of work, right? Yes. So like I think people are fully capable of it. Like I don't think that there is anyone who would be like, gosh, I don't think I want my dream job because I can't handle this. And on the way the process has changed that you asked about, or that could change, I think the one tweak that has been made in the last few years, and we can all probably thank COVID for it, and is the virtual interviews, right? So at least people aren't flying back and forth. I mean, that genuinely, I can see why, especially as a player, you'd be like, that's frustrating. Like you're actually gone for a day and a half. Right. Whereas like if you're hopping on a Zoom for an hour, like, I don't know. I don't think that's
yeah, I see what you're saying there, because it's the physically being away that would be, to me, like kind of an impediment to preparing for the game. But we do all types of things during the week, whether it's the regular season or the postseason, that have nothing to do with football. It's about time management. And I guess that begs the question, what is the biggest commonality from a personality standpoint, or there's a trait that you found that kind of ties these dynamic future coaches together, the ones that work out in your experience?
I think so I really do believe that every single person is unique. I think that there's folks who've done incredible analytics, like Parag Marate at the 49ers, really trying to study every time he ever did a hiring cycle, like, are there things that tie together the folks that are successful? Are there backgrounds? But I think we've seen people come from a lot of different backgrounds who are successful. I mean, I will say, and I think this is probably true of all coaches, not just successful ones. Like we were talking about, the type A personality, their leadership quality. Obviously, I think you have mentioned before, like you can't fool a room full of players. And like, I will tell you, probably the most intimidating, experiences I've ever had are when I had to like actually present. Because if you walk into that room, like that is not a room that is going to tolerate any nonsense, right? Yeah. Like they will smell fear, and like
they smell fear. Yeah, it's true. It's like, when I got to go talk to a group of like middle schoolers, I'm scared out of my mind because I feel like they can smell fear too, just like pro football players, like
100%.
So I totally, but you can fool owners, can't you? I mean, not that that's the objective, but like, I feel like one of the biggest disconnects, to your point earlier, is this hiring process is way different in so many ways, but in one way that I think it's wildly different is, owners are not necessarily football experts. The variability is crazy. And so, these guys, mostly guys, seem to misread people. I was just giving props to Sheila Ford-Ham, because I think in 2020 when she took over, she's the reason that if you're a Detroit Lions fan, you're like, we are not the same old Lions. Mm-hmm. We have different leadership. We have different GM. We have a different coach. We have a different culture. We have a culture strong enough that Ben Johnson wants to forego better opportunities and he wants to stay here. That's what you're trying to build. So what do you think the biggest challenge is in like reading these billionaire dudes?
So I I love that you brought her up because there has been some good coverage on the process that she put together, the type of people she wanted to bring in, the fact that she wanted, former player perspectives, and that she knew the type of person and culture that she felt would be a fit.
Right.
Because I do think part of people's success or failure is about shared expectation. And so, like, not every franchise is a fit for every person who could be successful in one place, but maybe not in another. And some of that is role clarity too, because you see conflict when, there's two people who think that they should be calling the shot on whether it's, final say on the roster, whatever you want it to be. There needs to be real clarity about like who calls what shots, whose lane is what. And like, what is it that we are, right? If you own the franchise, all culture is truly set from the top. And so that's got to be really clear, and you've got to find the person who's the right fit. And I think you've given an example of a team that did that really beautifully.
Give me an example of who's in the room for these actual interviews. Once they get, once you cross that Zoom threshold and you're doing it in person, who's in the room? What's the tone like? What's the vibe like? How much does it vary? And how intimidating can it be?
Well, it varies a lot. I think one of the interesting trends you're seeing in the last couple of years is people involving a lot more folks at the table. And I think that that's a good thing, because you've made the argument that, one person who didn't do this particular job before, right, hiring for it, is maybe not the best process. And certainly if you look at it from a DEI perspective, historically did not, yield the best results from a DEI perspective. And so I think what you saw when the Vikings hired Kwesi, what you saw with some other folks' processes is that they decided to take a much bigger swath of the building, to involve some people from the business side, to involve potentially some outside voices or some player voices like you've talked about, and just have a more inclusive process. And that can yield, not only more inclusive results, but really successful results.
And rewinding, just so people understand, like, and this is my understanding and just doing a little bit of research, but help me out here, is there are time limits on how much you can prepare for these interviews while you're a member of a certain team in the playoffs. Like, right, the expectation is you should be preparing within a window, but a lot of this preparation, as you alluded to, metaphorically speaking, you've been preparing your whole life, but there is real intentional prep in the off season leading up for guys that are expecting to maybe be in these cycles.
Yeah. And I mean, I would argue that you should, right, if you're in that situation where you're expecting that I could be hired into a GM role or head coach role in the next year or two or three even, you should be doing a ton of preparation in the offseason. Like, to me, it's like, if you have studied for the test, like, the test shouldn't be hard.
Right.
So, like, and I'll give you an example because I come from originally a legal background. The bar is like a 3-day intense test, and you do like a month and a half prep class after 3 years of law school. And it's like, by the time you get to the test, like, you should just nail that thing. Like, you shouldn't still be thinking about it the day before the test. Like, you should just get a good night's sleep and show up. Like,
yeah, it only took me one time, so
there you go. So it's really the same thing. Like, the prep work should be done so far in advance. And yes, for a specific team, right? Just like any regular Joe going to interview with an employer, like, yeah, obviously you want to research the employer, but we're in a situation where there's actually only 32 employers.
Right.
And you've probably been working in the league for 10, 15 years.
Yes.
So, like, you have more than enough time over those years to really gather a lot of great information about who you might be interviewing with.
How does somebody in that situation decide whether or not they're worthy of studying and doing the extra work and seeking counsel? You know what I mean? Like, how do you actually say, because that's a weird conversation. Like, I'm like, hey, I think I'm a good coach, but am I at that point yet? Like, for some of the people on the fence, and then for guys that have tremendous years, Like, I don't know if a Dave Canales was on the radar for people a year ago.
Yeah, I guess if you believe in yourself, I feel like you want to be ready when you are hot to the point that you just made, right? Because there are guys who suddenly become like a hot name in the media out of nowhere.
Hmm.
And you could be like not a hot name a couple years later and to
Yes.
no fault of your own. You're not a different person, you're not a different coach, but like you and I have both seen that with plenty of guys where like they
Hmm.
were like circulated in, like, oh, this is the guy, this is the hot guy, and they don't get a job for a cycle or two, and all of a sudden they're like dead. It's like
Hmm.
they're never mentioned again.
Who's somebody you can think of in that vein that was their name was hot for a little bit? It's so
So
cool.
Greg Roman, who I love, who
Greg
I
Roman,
worked with
yeah.
at the 49ers, people were like all over, oh, he's going to be a head coach. He's going to be a head coach. And, like things just shifted and it's the situation you're in, maybe you're somewhere and things don't go as well the next year. And all of a sudden, like, that's just not on people's sort of lists
Yeah.
anymore. And it
Yeah.
gets also to the issue within this, like, whole hiring process of the role that people like what you are now play, the media.
Yeah.
The media has arguably a big influence on the whole process because so much of what the people who are doing hiring are hearing is folks like you saying who's hot.
Yes.
So it gets into who gets to decide who's hot and what is their background and knowledge, right? Like you've been saying, hey, what do these people know about football? Now you obviously played the game, you know a lot about football, but
But
there's plenty
still,
of people I bet you think in your field who maybe don't know.
yeah, but still, I mean, even me, when I make a determination on a coach, I can go off of the scheme, I can go off some hearsay about who they are, I can text the guy and say, what's that guy like? But as you know, the variability on, who a guy is to the players in the building, it could depend on what part of the locker room you're in. It could depend on what player you're talking to. There's so much, as you know, more than me. There's so much going on in an NFL facility that the media is not even scratching the surface on. And we have the wrong narratives, and there are things going on internally between players and positions that are the friction's crazy, but you're not seeing it. Or maybe you think some guy's the bad guy and it's actually another coach that's screwing the whole thing up. So we don't know. And so I try to be careful about quote unquote endorsing guys. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Because I wondered the same thing, and I think I know the answer, and I would imagine it's agents, but like who are ultimately the people that set those wheels in motion, those big wheels that
The
dictate who
media
the hot
wheels.
names. Yeah.
I do think agents have a role to play there. I think direct relationships, though, with coaches and with
Yeah.
scouts is also a big part of it. And so I think one of the challenges that people face is how to manage those relationships.
Right.
So I do think that that's a part of it. And to the point you just made, I think one of the interesting things about like who can determine who's hot is in the GM cycle, where like coaches, like if a guy's been a coordinator, at least you have something that you could have watched on TV and made a judgment about. You don't know what this guy's scouting, like what were his scouting reports for the last 5 years? Can I go, like, you have no idea really, like if you're an outsider of like what role that person played. All you know is if they were at a team that was winning or not, or
Yeah.
what their title is. So I think that and yet somehow the media does, make these determinations like, oh, this guy is coming up in this cycle. This guy's, a hot name.
Is it rare to have an outlier coach who's not thought of as one of these, within this pool of exceptional names with exceptional resumes that everybody's kind of agreed on? The way I look at it, owners are generally, their council generally agrees with them for the most part in their personal circles. That's what happens, my opinion, is when you have a lot of money and a lot of power, most people agree with you, and if you can get somebody
as a person who has done a lot of disagreeing with people, I mean, I think if you have a good circle, you have people who disagree with you, right?
so there are
I
those
agree
good
that
circles.
it's a very dangerous place to be, and certainly anyone with a lot of either fame or power or money is always going to be at risk of being surrounded by yes men. That's inevitably going to be a risk, and hopefully you make sure that you have people around you who will tell you that the emperor has no clothes.
Yeah, exactly. My question would be then, if somebody exists outside this pool, like how often does somebody elevate to getting an opportunity where that name is only on the docket for one team and they're on to somebody, right? They've identified a really good outlier type coach. Because for the most part, I feel like they all pick from the same pool that they've decided upon together, whether they know it or not, because of media influence and because of just whoever the hot names are, the suggestive nature of it. How many times do we get an outlier?
Yeah, and it also that gets into an interesting question of like what is truly an outlier, because the one of the things that's so unique about these hires is that there's a small pool, right? Like most jobs you could hire for, at any company, there are probably thousands of people in, the United States, the world, who could, be qualified, apply, have the experience. Whereas like you have a very small pool
Yeah.
of everyone who coaches in college and everybody who coaches in the NFL.
Yeah.
That you could go with. And so it raises actually an interesting question of, how do you, if you want to be the person who finds the outlier, track over time everyone in these roles? Because it's certainly possible. It's a limited group of people. But yeah, I think you raise an interesting question there. And what it makes me think of next is I do think one of the areas where the league has been helpful is in having an accelerator program so that more people are getting exposure, specifically to the folks who would hire them, right, to owners, and putting out a comprehensive list every year of, hey, all of these people are folks that you ought to look at, and it's a long list.
Stock market concept with these guys, as you alluded to earlier, your name could be hot 1 minute and then 2 years later maybe not so much. So there is the, hey, get it while the getting's good and all that. But I look at a guy like Jeff Ulbrich. Usually that stock market seems dictated by the team's success. You know what I mean? And I don't know, Jeff, this isn't me pumping his tires or anything. Like, half the time I don't want to be one of those media members, but I just picked his name. Mm-hmm. There aren't a lot of guys who get credit for what their units have done, especially within the context of the struggles that they might have incurred, trying to do their jobs because of the other side of the ball or the team's lack of success. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's just the answer's as easy as people aren't hiring coaches from bad teams, or do you think that that's an area that people should look more?
I do. I think that is a struggle that so many people, in the NFL faces. If you're on a bad team, people like kind of feel like you're a loser. Mm-hmm. And if you're on a good team, people feel like you're a winner. And, and most people, if they work in the NFL long enough, you're going to be on winning teams and you're going to be on losing teams and you're still you. But like, you can't.
I know what you mean.
It's just, yeah. I mean, you've experienced
Hall,
that, right?
Me and James Hall know what you mean. They thought we were losers. Poor James went from Detroit to St. Louis. So yeah, it's a perfect example though. I mean, yeah, like I think for players, it can be the same way. Obviously we're going to get more jobs because there's more job openings, and you can leave your bad team in free agency and you can differentiate. But I feel bad for some of these coordinators and coaches who are just stuck in tough spots. When it comes to the consultation process for you, or whatever you want to call it, like you're getting to know the coach and trying to figure out where the blind spots are maybe, or laying out what an owner or that group is going to want to hear. What do you think are the most surprising things because it's been described to me like the modern day NFL coach is a CEO more than just a ball coach. What are those things that
I think both of them.
Yeah. What are those things that might surprise people that make up that list of skills or responsibilities?
Sure. I mean, to me, and again, because my focus is solely on that aspect, right? Like I'm not here to tell anybody about football. Like that's what your expertise is. That's not my job. So in thinking about what are those other areas, I think a lot of it is managing people. So again, like depending on the background that you've come from, and I'll use a GM example, right? If you have come up as especially if you come up from a road scouting perspective, you may not have even been in the building, right? Like you have literally been like totally out on your own, and you're coming back in for meetings. And so you may not, and this isn't a knock on people, it's just that you may not have had the experience until much later in your career, if you've risen to like a director of college scouting or something like that, of even managing other people and even managing office dynamics and politics. And like, that's not, politics isn't like a bad word. Like everywhere that has human beings has politics, right? Every NFL team, just like every other workplace, has politics. And your ability to lead and manage people, lead and manage departments, I think, you know, for an average fan, they might only think about that job as picking players, when it's in fact like you're probably overseeing the medical team, athletic training, the fields, and people, you know, underestimate like groundskeeping is like actually like a big thing, like travel logistics, player engagement. Like there's all these other departments that you're responsible for leading that, again, until very late in your career, maybe never before you get that job, you have any experience running. And then I also think, and this part is probably more obvious, but dealing with the media is now a really big part of these jobs. And so I think people's skill level with that is important, especially on the head coach side, probably even more than the GM side. That's a huge part. And it's not that you're going to pick somebody to be your head coach because they're good at the media if they're a loser, right? Like you got to win. Yeah. But it's a lot easier on your franchise if the guy wins and he's good with the media.
Right. No question. Speaking of people that don't seem to like the media, my old ball coach, Bill Belichick. If I was Bill Belichick, what do you think the biggest challenges are for me in this process? Or another way of asking, what has changed since Bill last interviewed for a head coaching job? What were interviews like in 2000 or 1999?
Well, I was graduating from high school, so I'm not 100% sure.
I'm sure some of the old timers have told you. I'm sure some of the, you know, because didn't you get to work with Al Davis?
I did.
While he was still around, and
yeah.
Like, what do people say about how much less exhaustive or more exhaustive it was, or what was that process like? When did these things get guardrails? You know, like the process. You know, I'm sure there was a Wild West period where it was like a lot easier to just pick up the phone and call a coach week 7 and be like, hey, you know, on your dial up and be like, hey, what do you think? You want to work for us next year?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are probably some people who would question whether or not, you know, that potentially still happens based on outcomes. But yeah, a lot has changed. I will say I have loved every Bill Belichick press conference I've ever watched. For the record, I actually think he's great and super entertaining. And so I love a Marshawn Lynch press conference. So I'm not saying you have to like be, you know, super sweet softy all the time with the media. And this is the other piece. I think some of this is like more important in the hard times, right? Like if you're winning, you can be a jerk, right? And get away with it. And, you know, when you're 9-8 or whatever, you know, like then it starts being like, oh, I don't know about that. So some of this is also like, how do you put yourself in the best position for your own longevity so that you are in a good space, that you get the benefit of the doubt, right? That you have enough time to accomplish what you are capable of accomplishing. And yes, I think a lot has changed probably since the last time that he interviewed. For one thing, there were no Zoom interviews because there was no Zoom.
Like 4 years ago.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot has changed.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think you asked what would be the biggest impediment. And honestly, I think the biggest impediment is probably that we do still live in a world where you know, ageism is a real thing. And so I honestly think that would probably be the hardest piece. And that he has such a rich history at one club that if you're another club, I think it's like hard to sort of be like, okay, what's our vision and our future? Because everyone associates Bill with the Patriots.
Yeah. Yeah, no question. And then it's way too easy to look and say, well, you know, his winning percentage when he was with this team. I'm like, well, that sample size is so small. You know, it's hard to draw any sort of conclusion other than the guy is one of the absolute greatest football minds to ever walk the earth. And yeah, so it's complicated for somebody like that. You touched on ageism. Let's talk about everybody's favorite topic, which is equity in hiring. And you know, some people don't want to hear about it, but it's still an issue. And you know, I've done podcasts where I've grappled with the shortcomings of the Rooney Rule, and you know, like I just wonder. I know we're not there yet. What's it going to take, and what are some of the positives of some of the changes they've made in the last couple of years, and where could they improve?
Yeah, I do think the biggest change that's happened in the last couple of years, and it is starting to yield results, and obviously we'll have to wait and see a few more years to get more data, is the accelerator program. Because I think a lot of us in the league who've been around a long time had been feeling like what people need is exposure. Because it's not a pipeline issue, right? It's not that there are not good coaches or GMs out there, potential GMs out there. It's that, you know, everyone, and this is not specific to the NFL, right? This is how all human beings behave and how our brains are hardwired, unless we are consciously overtaking it. We all are naturally drawn to people who are like us. We are all drawn to hire people who we feel comfortable around, where we're like, oh, you know, I can talk to that person. I can have a beer with that person. I feel, you know, it's a fit, right? All these, you know, code words, etc. And there's nothing intrinsically wrong with the fact that all human beings have implicit bias, but it's our responsibility to then figure out how to overcome that. Yeah. And I do think that one of the biggest things is exposure, right? It's meeting. It's like, oh yeah, I remember so-and-so that I met at that program. Getting that opportunity to just kind of hang out's not the right word, but like network and just have small talk, and it allows people to get more comfortable so that the next time you are in a hiring cycle, you're like, yeah, I know this person. I like this person. Hopefully, you know, that interview, you know, it's even smoother, right? So I do think that the exposure piece is important. I think the Rooney Rule has been important historically. You know, at the 49ers were the first team to expand that to the whole business side, to have diverse slate interviewing of candidates, and then to also flip that and have it on the other side of the table for the interviewers, that there needs to be people on the interviewer panel who are people of color and women. And I think we were chatting earlier about who's in the room. And I do think that we're starting to see that trend of having more people in the room. And I think having a diverse slate in the room in the decision-making process is going to be, hopefully, a big part of improving those outcomes.
I was watching the Antonio Pierce process, and, you know, from the beginning, I'm biased. I know Antonio a little bit, but I also I love it when a player gets an opportunity. And you can see what a differentiating factor that player can be. White or black, Dan Campbell, Antonio Pierce, Vrabel. I mean, it means something, you know, and I thought it was awesome that you had this interim head coach who was in a situation where, I'll just say this, I don't know if he gets the job if they didn't mess up the Rich Bisaccia thing, right or wrong. I think he should get the job, but I think that helped. It was like the perfect storm. But then they're like, well, we still got to interview. We still got to, you know, like we got to go through the process. Was that kind of unique? Like where you're like, hey, we've got a coach who I think is the guy. And did the Rooney Rule apply? Some people were asking me, they still have to go out and interview and fulfill the guidelines of the Rooney Rule, even if the interim head coach is minority?
So two things come to mind here. One, I think, and this is me sort of speaking personally, I think it's actually really important to follow process no matter who the candidate is. Because I've had, even like in my in hiring processes, not involving these folks, but involving folks on the business side, where people will say, oh, well, I have somebody and she's already a woman, or like I have somebody, they're already a person of color. And it's like, it's not about, hey, I found somebody who's a person of color, and so I'm going to skip the whole process. Like, following process is about how you can only get the right results over time if you always follow the process.
Right.
You know, like it gets the whole, like, if you want championship culture, like Bill Walsh would always say, right? Like, you have to, you know, do everything like a champion. And so, like, when you come to a hiring process, you're not going to skip over it just because you're like, oh, well, I think we got the end result that we wanted.
Yeah.
No, like, we're going to follow it every time, because that's the only way to ensure that over time you get the right person. Like, every time, and that you have the right DEI results. So I do think it's important, even when you think you have the person, and even if they're a person of color, to interview multiple people. Like, you don't know what you're going to learn from that process until you go through it.
Well, yeah. And like, as a side note, the guys who are getting valuable opportunities to interview, you know, who are people of color, and who are, you know, oftentimes former players or whoever. I think the Raiders going through that, I can still see the value in it. But for people at home, you know, I got some questions like, do they still have to go through that? I'm like, well, I really don't know the answer. You know, I'm not sure, but it seems like that's the right thing to do for multiple reasons.
Yeah, and I do love the trend of more former players as head coaches in the NFL, or in really any executive position or any position on the business side or the football side in the NFL. And I think that's something that 20 years ago I wondered, like, why aren't there more former players? And like you said, I don't think it matters what ethnicity they are, but also if we're seeing more former players, based on the demographics of the NFL, that should ultimately yield better results. And in the NBA, you see a ton of former players who are head coaches, right? And I think, yes, there are differences between the NBA and the NFL, but in kind of what the process of becoming a head coach. But I love that trend. Like, and I think one that you didn't mention, but you probably I know you mentioned before, Jim Harbaugh. You know, like they're great track record. You know, we were just talking about, okay, what are some commonalities among some great coaches? Obviously, not every great coach was a player, but former players have a pretty good track record.
Doug Peterson
Being head coaches.
Doug Peterson, because we just went through it the other way. We just went through it the other day where somebody on the show was like, hey, you know, and don't forget this, Jim Harbaugh was a high performing NFL quarterback.
Yeah.
And, you know, it seems so obvious to people. There are very few, I went back and looked, former quarterbacks in modern football that played at a high level in the NFL, and were head coaches. And I think, yeah, it's kind of a cheat code if the guy's got it all, because he's literally been the most important player on the field. The other question I have as it relates to being an offensive coach, being a defensive coach, I know it's not a pipeline issue because there are great coaches, as you talked about, but there does seem to be, I don't know how to phrase it, but there seems to be a design flaw or an intentional design flaw where it's like, well, we're not hiring as many defensive coaches these days. You know, it would seem that a lot of black coaches get funneled into, when you talk to some younger black coaches, like, hey, I don't get the opportunities to be they guard the QB room, you know, the offensive line room. How many black offensive line coaches are there in the league? How many black quarterback coaches are there in the league? It's just certain position groups get hired to be coordinators more often than others. And if the machine is feeding, you know, one, you know, is feeding, you know, the offensive coaches, that's going to be a problem over time.
Agreed. And actually, this brings up another name. We were just talking about, like, names that are hot and then weren't. And, you know, former QB, to your point, Byron Leftwich, right? Like, there's somebody who, like, the name was hot, but I'm like, I didn't hear that name in the last, like, 2 years. Right. Yeah. It's like, so.
I don't even know where he is.
I was like, God, do I know nothing about football suddenly? Because I'm like, wait,
don't worry about it, because
right
that's supposed to be my job, and I don't know where Byron Leftwich is. And two
If
years
you're out there,
ago,
Byron, tell us where you are.
yeah, so we can be like, hire this guy. I mean,
Yeah, but there is no question the trend is towards offensive side of the ball, QB coaches, and I do think a positive there is like the league has caught on to this issue and is focusing on how do we get more people into quarterback coaches roles so that pipelines into offensive coordinators because we know that pipelines into head coaching roles.
how do people feel about the comp pick deal when it comes to the Rooney Rule? Is that like kind of a...
It's so controversial.
It is a little bit. I mean, and I want what's best for whoever wants to get the job. So it's not really for me to say whether or not it's a good thing or it you know, or if it objectifies you, you know, kind of in a sense professionally where, you know, you're worth something in a non-personal sense. It's like, well, let me get this guy elevated because we're going to get something out of it. Like, what have you seen when it comes to those trends?
So what I would say is I don't have a final opinion on this one. I think it'll be interesting over time to see like, did this move the needle or is it, and I am wary to use the word distraction because I think it's used in our industry like for so many things that aren't like appropriate, but like, is it causing more discussion than progress? And I don't know where that'll ultimately come out. I understand and think it is intriguing that you're incentivizing people to elevate folks, which I think is a good thing, because what you're trying to counterbalance that I think has really probably not talked about enough and is really problematic is that the anti-tampering policy is used so much to block talent from growing. And so if you step back and you're in the position of wanting the whole league to be the best that it can, and not just the most diverse and inclusive that it can, but literally just you want the best talent to rise to these positions, then we should be creating as free a market as we can.
Right.
But that is always like, actually no, because if you read the anti-tampering policy, like you are able to really prevent talent from going up and out a lot of the time. And there have thankfully been rule changes in the last few years that have helped tweak this at the top, meaning that you can't block somebody from becoming a number two, and you now have to designate who that number two is. And that's progress, and I love that. Right. But what it doesn't fix is that in those whole early years of your career that could be very formative and important for your growth, you have somebody can just lock you up, and unless you choose to bet on yourself and decide that you're going to let your contract expire, you don't want to keep signing extensions, then you really don't. Somebody can just say, hey, they can't interview you. And you might not even know that. You don't even know that somebody put in a request for you.
That's the wild part to me. Like, that to me is crazy. I mean, it's all crazy anyways, because I know you can't name names, but I know there are coaches in the NFL at different times that have had reputations for kind of hoarding their guys and blocking progress for those assistant coaches. But on top of it, to not know your worth, in effect, you're playing with your hands tied behind your back.
Yep.
It's nuts. You know what else I thought was nuts, Hannah, was when Vrabel was asked, well, I don't know how that went down, but if I had to guess, if they were like, hey, could we trade you? And he was like, yeah, fuck off, or whatever he would have said. I did not know they had no trade clauses. These coaches. You can't trade a head coach without their permission?
So again, because coaches and everyone other than players is not subject to a collective bargaining agreement, right? They're not in a union. Everyone's individually negotiating. So it doesn't mean that everyone has that, right? But it means that he negotiated properly as an individual. And so, yeah, I mean, and the irony is, most workers in America, your employer cannot trade you somewhere else, right? And I get why, from a player perspective, you'd be like, hey, what the heck? I don't have a no trade clause. But like, that's the trade-off of having a union, right? It's the trade-offs of collective bargaining is you have decided, even if you didn't personally decide, you decided collectively with your, 1,200 person brethren as a union,
Or
like,
500,
all right, like,
whoever voted.
get this, we're gonna, agree, yes,
Yeah.
there can be trades of a player's contract. And I think that like language that we use is important. And because I just hate the word like a person got traded, because it's a contract got traded, not a person. Because no one can own you, but like you can sign a contract that says like somebody else could be assigned to this contract.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And just the last thing with Ben and Slowick, Ben Johnson today saying, "Hey, I'm staying put." Slowick staying put. Like, I've always wondered why more coordinators don't look at things, to say, and it's easy for me to say because I'm not trying to map out my family's future, and these opportunities are great, but I've always been somebody that's like, play the long game. And if you have the safety net to do that as a coach, or you have a situation that you feel good about, it's a lot easier to not jump at that job. Like Ben Johnson, that Carolina job sounded like it looked scary to him last year, and I would be afraid as well. This is just me talking to work for David Tepper. That's just me talking. But today, him saying, "Hey, I don't want to go to Washington. I don't want to go to Seattle. I want to stay right where I am," and Bobby Slowick getting a raise. Okay, like that one to me, I'm surprised we don't see that more often, because these owners have big pocketbooks. If I had a dynamic play caller in my building, sure, I would be throwing the kitchen sink at that play caller, because there's no cap for hiring coaches, is there?
Correct.
Like, are we going to see that more in the future, or does it go on more than we know, where people are like, "Hey, we don't want to let this guy leave. He's going to be paid like a head coach, or sort of like a head coach, without ruffling the feathers of the head man who's still wants the biggest contract"?
What I would say is, yeah, people are going to pay for somebody they want to keep. Yeah, like yes, people are going to get paid more if they think you could go somewhere else. But also, like, I think all of those decisions, like you were saying, like, oh, like, I'm surprised you don't see more people kind of decide to stay put. The conversation we were just having, where like, you don't know if your name's going to be hot again in a year. It's a very personal decision about where you are, how much you like it, what you think the chances are that the team's going to continue to get better, what you think your future opportunities are, and what you think of the current opportunities available to you. Like, you may feel like the ones that are open don't feel like the right fit to you for whatever reason. And that's not necessarily a knock on them, but like, that's just not what interests you. And so you may want to be clear publicly that you've decided to stay put.
Right.
Because you don't want people thinking you just didn't get any of those openings.
Right. It's a save face thing. Like, I broke up with them,
Right. And that's not a bad, like, I'm not saying that's a bad thing at all. It's just that, like, if you do get passed over in multiple cycles, that can unfortunately influence the media and public perception. So it makes sense to be clear when you've decided not to be in the running.
Well, this is how my brain thinks. Like Ben, who I'm a big fan of, doesn't get the job supposedly, or doesn't decide to leave. He, people are talking about he's asking for all this money. It could be a number of things. He could have scared people off with the contract talks. He could have not gotten the job. Maybe his name's not as hot as people thought. Or maybe it is as simple as he knows, and he's made that determination along the lines of what we talked about, which, what drives that stock market? It's the success of your team, right? And he's saying, I don't want to put words in his mouth or thoughts in his head, but he's saying, we're going to still be good. Like, what's going to change if I'm still in the building, if Jared's still here, if Dan's still here? We could be right back here next year, and maybe a job I would like more would be open. Sure. And juxtaposed to Canales, who, like, again, I'm just reading the tea leaves. A coach like him, who a year ago wasn't on the radar, you got to jump at the opportunity. It may not be perfect, but you got to jump at it. And that's there's a couple ways this could go for coaches. There's no right answer, right? It sounds like there's no chart that you look at and you're like, if this happens, I do this. You gotta make judgment calls, which I think is pretty interesting.
And it's okay for people to love what they do. Like, it's okay. Even if somebody said, you know what, I actually have no interest in being a head coach. I actually love being a coordinator. and like this is what I want to do. Like that's okay too.
Is that not like the most sane thing somebody could say? I know you're in the business of prepping people to become head coaches, but I think it's crazy. I think it's crazy to want to be a head coach. Like when I've seen the stress that they live under, their schedules. Like Steve Spagnuolo, who I'm a huge fan of, was my head coach in St. Louis. Me and James, and obviously didn't work out as a head coach, but singing his praises every week because he's one of the best coordinators we've seen in modern football. And you just wonder, the guy that was sleeping on his sofa and wouldn't see his wife Maria for like days on end. Maybe he likes being around his family. You know, maybe he likes being the coordinator. Maybe he likes not worrying about how many timeouts he has. Maybe he likes worrying about not worrying about training camp schedule or which buses we're taking here. All the things that it's perfectly sane to say, hey, I like being a ball coach. Hannah, I really appreciate the time. This is so interesting to me. Can't wait to get you back on to expand the conversation because I think it could go on and on. But thank you. Thank you very much for letting us in on what goes on.
My pleasure, Chris.